Hello everyone, this is a discussion video intended for Psychology 105N or Physiological Biological Psychology. For this video, we will be talking about the cells and the nervous system. As human beings, these mental experiences that we have are composed of activities of separate but interconnected cells. To understand the nervous system, the place to begin is to examine the cells that compose it. The nervous system consists of two kinds of cells, neurons and glia. Neurons receive information and transmit it to other cells. Glia serves many functions that are difficult to summarize, and we shall defer that discussion until later in this video. The adult human brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons on average. The exact number varies from person to person. We now take it for granted that the brain is composed of individual cells, but the idea was in doubt as recently as the early 1900s. Until then, the best microscopic views revealed little detail about the brain. Observers noted that long, thin fibers between one cell body and another, but they could not see whether a fiber merged into the next cell or stopped before it. In the late 1800s, Santiago Ramon y Cajal used newly developed staining techniques to show that a small gap separates the tip of a neuron's fiber from the surface of the next neuron. The brain, like the rest of the body, consists of individual cells. Figure 1.2 illustrates a neuron from the cerebellum of a mouse. Neurons have much in common with the rest of the body's cells. The surface of a cell is its membrane or plasma membrane, a structure that separates the inside of the cell from the outside environment. Most chemicals cannot cross the membrane but permit a controlled flow of water, oxygen, sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride, and other important chemicals. Except for mammalian red blood cells, all animal cells have a nucleus, the structure that contains the chromosomes. A mitochondrion, or for plural is mitochondria, is the structure that performs metabolic activities, providing the energy that the cell uses for all activities. Mitochondria have genes separate from those in the nucleus of a cell, and mitochondria differ from one another genetically. According to Aoki and Cortis 2016, people whose mitochondria are less active than normal are predisposed to depression and pains, while mutated mitochondrial genes are a possible cause of autism. Based on what I've just mentioned a while ago, the physiological structures of the human body could have an effect on one's mental health. Aside from the environmental factors, genetics could also play a role in how a person thinks and behaves. Ribosomes are the sites within a cell that synthesize new protein molecules. Proteins provide building materials for the cell and facilitate chemical reactions. Some ribosomes float freely within the cell, but others are attached to the endoplasmic reticulum, which is a network of thin tubes that transport newly synthesized proteins to other locations. The most distinctive feature of neurons is their shape, which varies enormously from one neuron to another. So please see figure 1.3. Unlike most other body cells, neurons have long branching extensions. All neurons include a soma or cell body, and most also have dendrites, an axon, and presynaptic terminals. The tiniest neurons lack axons, and some lack well-defined dendrites. With its soma in the spinal cord, a motor neuron receives excitation through its dendrites and conducts impulses along its axon to a muscle. The sensory neuron is specialized at one end to be highly sensitive to a particular type of stimulation, such as light, sound, or touch. The sensory neuron conducts touch information from the skin to the spinal cord. Dendrites are branching fibers that get narrower near their ends. So the term dendrite comes from a Greek root word meaning tree. A dendrite branches is like a tree. The dendrite's surface is lined with specialized synaptic receptors at which the dendrite receives information from other neurons. The greater the surface area of a dendrite, the more information it can receive. The cell body or soma, Greek for body and its plural form is somata, contains the nucleus, ribosomes, and mitochondria. Most of a neuron's metabolic work occurs here. The term axon comes from a Greek word meaning axis. The axon conveys an impulse toward other neurons, an organ, or a muscle. So as presented on your screens, that is a representation of a motor and sensory neuron. So you can see there the essential parts of a neuron. As a continuation of the structure of a neuron, a myelin sheath is an insulating material with interruptions known as nodes or ranvia. Although a neuron can have many dendrites, it can have only one axon, but the axon may have branches. The end of each branch has a swelling called a presynaptic terminal, also known as an end bulb. Other terms associated with neurons are afferent, efferent, and intrinsic. An afferent axon brings information into a structure. An efferent axon carries information away from a structure. Every sensory neuron is afferent to the rest of the nervous system, and every motor neuron is an efferent from the nervous system. Within the nervous system, a given neuron is an efferent from one structure and afferent to another. You can remember that efferent starts with letter E as in exit. Afferent starts with A as in admit. If a cell's dendrites and axon are entirely contained within a single structure, the cell is an interneuron or intrinsic neuron of that structure. For example, an intrinsic neuron of the thalamus has its axon and all its dendrites within the thalamus. So neurons vary enormously in size, shape, and function. The shape of a neuron determines its connections with other cells and thereby determines its function. For example, in figure 1.8, you can see there the widely branching dendrites of the Purkinje cell in the cerebellum, see figure 1.8a, enable it to receive input from up to 200,000 other neurons. By contrast, bipolar neurons in the retina, see figure 1.8d, have only short branches and some receive input from as few as two other cells. You can see the variety of shapes of a neuron and the different functions they have. Glia or neuroglia is the other components of the nervous system. They perform many functions. The term glia, derived from a Greek word meaning glue, reflects early investigators' idea that glia was like the glue that held the neurons together. Glia outnumbers neurons in the cerebral cortex, but Neurons outnumber glia in several other brain areas, especially the cerebellum. Overall, the numbers are almost equal. The brain has several types of glia. The star-shaped astrocytes wrap around the synapses of functionally related axons. Tiny cells called microglia act as part of the immune system, removing viruses and fungi from the brain. They proliferate after brain damage, removing dead or damaged neurons. Oligodendrocytes in the brain and spinal cord and Schwann cells in the periphery of the body build the myelin sheaths that surround and insulate certain vertebrate axons. They also supply an axon with nutrients necessary for proper functioning. Radial glia guide the migration of neurons and their axons and dendrites during embryonic development. Although the brain, like any other organ, needs to receive nutrients from the blood, many chemicals cannot cross from the blood to the brain. The mechanism that excludes most chemicals from the vertebrate brain is known as the blood-brain barrier. Before we examine how it works, let's consider why we need it. So, when a virus invades a cell, mechanisms within the cell extrude virus particles through the membrane so that the immune system can find them. When the immune system cells discover a virus, they kill it and the cell that contains it. So, how the blood-brain barrier works. The blood-brain barrier depends on the endothelial cells that form the walls of the capillaries. Outside the brain, such cells are separated by small gaps, but in the brain, they are joined so tightly that they block viruses, bacteria, and other harmful chemicals from the passage. Water crosses through special protein channels in the wall of the endothelial cells. For certain other chemicals, the brain uses active transport. It is a protein-mediated process that expends energy to pump chemicals from the blood into the brain. Chemicals that are actively transported into the brain include glucose, which is the brain's main fuel, amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, purines, choline, a few vitamins, and iron. Insulin and probably certain other hormones also cross the blood-brain barrier, at least in small amounts. So neurons rely heavily on glucose, the only nutrient that crosses the blood-brain barrier in large quantities. They need thiamine, which is vitamin B1, to use glucose. In closing, everything the brain does depends on the detailed anatomy of its neurons and glia. Nothing in your experience or behavior follows from the properties of any one neuron. The nervous system is more than the sum of its cells, and our behavior emerges from the communication among neurons. So that ends my presentation. If you have questions or clarifications, feel free to contact me on my UB Facebook account. Thank you so much for being so attentive.